What's going on, guys? I'm Pete, and welcome to Retro Game Attic. So here we have the iconic Nintendo Game Boy camera. It's a pretty popular peripheral that was released back in 1998. I've had this one since I was a kid, and haven't messed around with it in quite a long time. And it got me thinking, this is compatible with pretty much all of the Game Boy models. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to test the Nintendo Game Boy camera on all of the compatible Game Boy consoles in order to see which is the most ideal to play it on. Before we do that, let's take a closer look at the Game Boy camera itself. So like I said, here is my childhood Game Boy camera that I've had since new. I did get a ton of mileage out of this back in the day, and I've packed it away for quite a long time, so I'm pumped to actually get this open. So we'll pop the top. There's the yellow Game Boy camera. As you can see, it's in pretty good condition for a kid who had it when he was like 13 years old. And there's typical Nintendo paperwork inside. Nothing too out of the ordinary. And the instruction manual. And that's pretty much it that I have in there. I have the bags that it came in. So as you can see, when this was released back in '98, it was definitely catered more towards the Game Boy Pocket line, but I think all in all, it's pretty much in the same lane as the original as well. Because they do have a really similar form factor and everything, the Pocket's essentially just a much smaller original Game Boy with a little bit bigger and a little bit better screen. So all you have to do to hook up the Game Boy camera is to insert it into the Game Boy's cartridge slot, and you're good to go. So let's try it out on the original Game Boy. So here are a few original Game Boy models. We have the OG, the original at the top, the 1989 gray edition, and then we have a few 1995 Play It Loud models, which are just different color shells on the original Game Boy. But I think for all intents and purposes, the Game Boy camera is a little more well suited to these colorful Game Boys versus the original. When you put it on the gray one, it fits. Everything seems to be working out pretty well, but I just think it looks better on the Play It Loud Game Boy, so that's what I'm going to go with for this video. So I think it's very fitting to try red on the red Play It Loud. And as you can see, it is protruding out the back quite a bit, but it doesn't feel off balance or anything like that. You can rotate the camera back and forth to shoot forwards and backwards. But yeah, the color of the Game Boy camera matches up to the Play It Loud Game Boy like perfectly. I think the heaviness of the original Game Boy console kind of counterbalances the heaviness of the Game Boy camera itself, so it's a little bit nicer than I thought it was going to be. So let's turn the Game Boy on. I'll mess around with the contrast a little bit to see if we can get it looking better. You can pick it up a little bit better on the camera now. It actually doesn't look half bad. Alright, so let's get out of here. We'll go to shoot, and we'll take a picture of the Game Boy with the Game Boy. It doesn't look half bad on the original Game Boy screen. And like I said before, the heaviness of the original Game Boy kind of acts as like a counterweight to the heaviness of the Game Boy camera. It actually feels really nice in the hand, and the screen on this thing is actually pretty good. It was better than I remembered it. But enough of the original Game Boy, let's move on to the Game Boy Pocket. Alright, so I have two Game Boy Pockets here. I have the original release, which lacks the power light indicator, and then I have my childhood one that I still have in the box. So let's pop it open. As you can see, this one got a little bit more usage. The sticker on the back isn't in the best of shape. It's definitely well loved. This is the one that I rocked from around 1998 all the way to about 2002. I didn't get the Game Boy Advance at release, so I used this for a pretty long time. So for those of you who don't know, the Game Boy Pocket here is the revision of the original Game Boy. As you can see, it's much smaller and thinner. It weighs quite a bit less. The original Game Boy takes 4 AA batteries, whereas the Game Boy Pocket takes 2 AAAs. And don't quote me on this, but I believe the battery life on the Game Boy Pocket is greatly improved as well. And as you can see too, the screen on the Game Boy Pocket is a little bit bigger than the original, and it doesn't have that iconic vomit green color like the original. So the Game Boy Pocket is definitely a welcome revision. It feels a little bit worse in the hands, in my opinion. Your hands are kind of a little bit closer together in the play position versus the original, but all in all, I would choose the Pocket over the original any day. So with that being said, let's pop the Game Boy camera in there and see how it looks. We'll try the yellow one, and this is the combo that I rocked for a long time when I was a kid. The screen clarity looks pretty similar to the Play It Loud Game Boy we tried before. Let's take a picture of the original Game Boy like we tried before. Alright, well, let's do a side-by-side comparison of the original Game Boy and then the Game Boy Pocket. And so I hate to say it, but the picture clarity looks a little bit better on the Game Boy original. So I think what we should do now is to switch the yellow camera and the red camera to see if the red photo on here looks better on the Game Boy Pocket. Alright, so it was just a bad photo that I took with the Pocket. The better photo on the red Game Boy camera looks quite a bit better on the Game Boy Pocket, I think, than the original. So I think when all is said and done, I would definitely pick the Pocket over the original, just because it has that slimmer form factor. It feels pretty balanced weight-wise. Like I said, the buttons are a little bit closer together, but the screen looks quite good on it. And just the fact that it's a little bit bigger than the original makes it a little more ideal to take photos on. on. But let's move on down the line and we'll try the Game Boy Color. So here we have the Game Boy Color, and right off the bat you can see that the screen is much more clear than both the Pocket and the original. The screen size actually seems to be a little bit smaller than the Pocket, which I didn't realize until now, which is pretty interesting. But overall it feels really good in your hands. It has that little bump on the back that I always liked. It made it a little bit more comfortable over the Pocket. But let's check out how the photos look on it. I'm going to call it right now. I'd say out of the two that we've tried so far, the Game Boy Color definitely looks the best, at least screen-wise. Form factor feels pretty good, and even aesthetics-wise, it definitely fits in that Game Boy camera lane. Nothing looks out of place here. So I guess so far, out of all three of these, I would probably go with the Color, just for that screen clarity. Photos are definitely going to look a lot better on it. Photo of my old dog here. It actually looks much better on here than I thought it would. Pretty cool. So moving on from the Game Boy Color, we're just going to keep going down the line here. Next up would be the Game Boy Advance. Alright, so here we have the Game Boy Advance, and as the name implies, it is definitely much more advanced than previous Game Boy consoles. It's capable of like a hybrid of 32/16-bit graphics, more akin to like a more powerful Super Nintendo. It has this landscape form factor with the buttons on either side of the screen itself. The screen is actually pretty nice. It's not backlit this time, but it's a lot clearer and it is capable of putting out a lot more colors than the Game Boy Color. So let's pop that red Game Boy camera into there and see how it goes. So right off the bat, I'm going to say that it's a little awkward. It sticks out the top quite a bit, but it doesn't feel like out of balance or anything. The Game Boy camera itself is pretty light, and I'm going to say it right now, it almost acts like a tripod. You have 2 points of articulation, whereas you might have a little bit more control with this. I could totally see that being a little bit more stable if you're trying to take photos, so that's pretty cool. But enough of that, let's power it on, and we'll turn up the volume a little bit. Like I said, it isn't backlit. You can kind of see that the screen is super clear. Like that dancing Mario looks awesome. So let's go to view, and we'll check out that Game Boy photo that we took before. So it does look super clear. It's pretty much on par with the Game Boy Color. So personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this landscape style. Granted, it's a little bit more comfortable to play traditional games, but I just think for the camera's sake, I'd prefer it to have like that traditional Game Boy style. But with that being said, if you are able to find a Game Boy Advance for pretty cheap and a Game Boy camera, it's really not that bad of a setup. But one more thing as a bonus, I have another Game Boy Advance here with a backlit IPS screen mod. So while we're here, let's check out the Game Boy camera on that modded Game Boy Advance. So you can see with the backlight, it definitely makes things look a bit better for sure and a little bit more visible, but it still looks pretty much the same in my opinion. Granted, it's a lot easier to see though. So let's go to view and we'll check out that Game Boy photo. Wow, you know, I'd almost hate to say it, but I think it looks actually a little bit better on the non-backlit screen. Yeah, the backlit on here really brings out the imperfections and just overall like pixelation of the photo. Yeah, granted it doesn't look bad or anything, but I'm gonna go with either the non-backlight or so far my overall preference is gonna be the Game Boy Color. So moving on from here, let's try out the next Game Boy in the line. That is the Game Boy Advance SP. So here's my Game Boy Advance SP that I bought new in 2003 when I was in high school. You can see I got it for $99.99. And we'll carefully open it up here. Here we have the AC adapter and the original receipt that I saved from Circuit City. We're most concerned with the Game Boy itself, so let's dig it out of there. And this really is a testament as to how OCD and good I kept my things, especially back then. There's really not much wear on this, and I used this thing a ton back in the day. So we'll pop in the camera into there. So right off the bat, you can see that the cartridge slot is bottom mounted, so it's a little bit awkward to use the camera for sure. And I'm surprised that this actually still has some battery power. I haven't charged this in forever. But you can see the screen clarity is pretty good. It's not as good as the IPS modded Game Boy Advance, but for the time it's actually pretty good. There is a revision of this that has a slightly better backlit screen. This is the AGS 001. The AGS 101 has the better backlit screen that's more akin to a Nintendo DS Lite, which I do actually have both of those, but I can't seem to locate them at the moment. But both SPs have the same form factor, and that's really what I'm concerned with here. So let's try to take a picture. So we'll turn the camera around, and it's a little bit hard to see from this video, but it's pretty difficult to get a good shot, just since it's mounted at the bottom like that. I am not the biggest fan of the form factor of the Advance SP. The buttons are a little bit close together, especially with the shoulder buttons. I feel a little bit awkward, but for camera's sake, this definitely is not ideal to play with. But let's check out how that Game Boy photo looks on here at least. I'd say the minor backlighting on here really does do it some favors because that pixelation really isn't exacerbated or anything. It doesn't look terrible. But for the sake of taking photos, this is just not ideal with a cartridge slot mounted on the bottom. bottom. So enough of the Game Boy Advance SP, let's move on to an important aspect of the Game Boy camera, the Game Boy printer. So here is the Game Boy printer, and as the box implies, you're able to print snapshots from your Game Boy camera with this printer. And this is my childhood Game Boy printer that I haven't used in a very long time, so I'm excited to crack this open and check it out. So here's the printer itself. It is model number MGB007, and I think it takes 6 AA batteries, so this thing's a little bit of a beast. It has your extension port where you're able to connect to your Game Boys, and here is the cable that comes with it. So it has the smaller side that can connect to the Game Boy printer, like I said, and then there's 2 ends of the cable. There's one bigger end and then one smaller end. The bigger end goes into the original Game Boy with that thicker expansion port, and then the smaller end goes into the Game Boy Pocket and other Game Boys with that smaller port. It should go into the Game Boy Color and so on. There it is in the Color, and then we'll try one more, the Game Boy Advance. Everything past the original Game Boy uses this smaller port. And I actually have an original box of Game Boy printer paper that I haven't used before. I'm excited to use this, and maybe we'll give it a try. So these printer paper rolls resemble kind of like a receipt roll. The paper itself has an adhesive backing. You're able to peel your photos off and use them as stickers in various places, which I did a ton of. So now that we checked out all compatible Game Boy models and the Game Boy printer itself, I want to dive into the Game Boy console adapters, starting with the Super Game Boy on the Super Nintendo. So let's dive into it. So as you can see, the Game Boy camera mounts backwards into the Super Game Boy's cartridge slot. Well, all you have to do is just turn the Game Boy camera around and you're good to go. And check out that title screen. It actually looks amazing on this TV, and it even has the custom Game Boy camera border for your Super Game Boy, which is a nice touch. And we'll go to that photo that we took before. And yeah, on a bigger screen like this, that photo looks horrible. I'd say out of all these so far, it probably looks the worst. Definitely very pixelated. There's no clarity. I'm not expecting much from a Game Boy camera, don't get me wrong, but this really doesn't look good at all. So let's try to take a photo with it and see if that will turn out any better. I mean, we're in pretty good light right here. I'm holding up a Game Boy Advance to it, and that looks horrible. Yeah, you can like barely make out what that is. Granted, this isn't the most ideal environment to take a photo. We have a light right above us, but that looks horrible and like super pixelated. If I didn't tell you what that was, you would probably not even know what it is. But I think I've had enough of the Super Game Boy. Let's move on to its successor, the Super Game Boy 2. So here we have the Super Game Boy 2. Just like the Super Game Boy 1, the Game Boy camera mounts backwards into it, and it's probably hard to tell from the video, but the Super Game Boy 2 actually runs at the correct speed of the original Game Boy. The Super Game Boy speeds it up very slightly, but that's just for purists. Most people won't know or even care about that. But so far, I mean, they both look the same. So let's check out those photos that we took. Yeah, super grainy, barely discernible. It looks pretty much the same as the Super Game Boy. And let's check out those photos we took before. There's that Game Boy Color. There's that barely visible Game Boy Advance photo that we took. So I say on the console side, it's probably not ideal to take photos, but the Game Boy camera does do a lot more. There's more functionality, like there's games available and things like that. This would probably be the most ideal to play something like this. Like this is definitely a lot more visible than something on a little tiny Game Boy screen. And it looks a lot better in my opinion. Granted, the photo of your character is not very visible or discernible, but playability, this is probably the way to go. So now that we have the Super Game Boy 2 set up, I should probably mention that it actually has an expansion port that the original Super Game Boy lacks. So I think we could probably hook up the Game Boy printer to this, or at least try it and see if we can print out some photos. So let's get it hooked up. So here's the Game Boy printer, and we'll hook it right into that expansion slot. So now that we have the Game Boy printer hooked up to the Super Game Boy 2, let's power it on, and I think we might be good to go. So let's print out that Game Boy photo and see if it works. Print. It's transferring, and a green LED light came on here, so it looks like that might work. No way, it's actually printing. All right, this hasn't been used in like probably 20 years. Feed it a little bit, and here is the end product. Granted, that Game Boy printer probably hasn't been used in at least 20 years or so. You can kind of see the Game Boy border a little bit and a little bit of remnants of that actual Game Boy photo itself. I don't think this is something that I would use or anything like that, but it's pretty cool to see that it actually still works to a degree. And furthermore, it's pretty awesome that it actually works on a Super Game Boy too. I really wasn't expecting that. So moving on from those Super Game Boy duos, let's go to my last Game Boy console peripheral, the Game Boy Player. So now that we have the Game Boy Player mounted to the bottom of the GameCube console, final step here is to take the Game Boy Player startup disc and put it in the console so it can communicate with the Game Boy Player. And it's as simple as that. So the Game Boy camera inserts right into the front of the player just like this. And we can turn the camera around, and here it is. It automatically started up, and it looks pretty standard. I mean, it resembles the Super Game Boy and the Super Game Boy 2. There's no graphical enhancements or anything like that here, aside from adding some colors. So let's go to View, Album. So here is our Game Boy photo, and it maintains that grody, pixelated look as seen on both of the Super Game Boys. So there's really nothing that we haven't seen here. It doesn't look too great on a console, to be honest. But we could try to take a picture. And as you can see, it's going to be a little bit difficult because, like I said, the Game Boy camera is mounted to the front of the console. So all you can really do is shoot up or rotate the camera back and shoot down. I guess you could shoot side to side. Actually, you can only shoot to one side. It doesn't rotate to this side. So your shooting options are pretty limited. But while we're here, let's get a good shot of what appears to be my basement ceiling. So yeah, you can't really even make out what that's even supposed to be. So photos on the Game Boy player are a no-go in my opinion. But like I said, there's other games that are available on here. You can kind of mess around a little bit. Space Fever looks good. It plays well. There's different borders that are offered on the Game Boy player that aren't available on the Super Game Boys. There's different screen filters and things like that. Timer. There's definitely more options that aren't available on the Super Game Boys. But for all intents and purposes, checking out the Game Boy camera on here, it's really not good at viewing photos. It's not great at taking photos. And if I had to choose one of the three that I've tried before, I'd probably go with the Super Game Boy 2. But you know what? Let's try one more thing. Let's hook up the Game Boy printer to the Game Boy player. Okay, so we're in. Let's go to View, turn that Game Boy printer on, and let's try printing a photo again. And here we go. It's transferring. Oh, it's actually working. Printing. Let's see how it looks. So here is that photo that we printed via the Game Boy player. It actually doesn't look too bad. You can kind of make out the Nintendo and Game Boy on the border and the Game Boy console itself. Doesn't look too bad for printer paper that's close to 26 years old. Pretty cool. I've never tried printing via a Game Boy player before, so that was an interesting little exercise. So that was my view on the Game Boy player with the Game Boy camera. I think out of all three of the console peripherals, the Super Game Boy, the Super Game Boy 2, and the Game Boy player, the Super Game Boy is definitely the worst, mainly because it lacks that expansion port that the Super Game Boy 2 and the Game Boy player have. Now, in terms of aesthetics, I'd say they all look pretty much the same. The photos don't look good, but the games and the extra content on the Game Boy camera all run well, and they all look about the same in all three. So there it is, guys. That was testing out the Game Boy camera on all compatible Game Boy models. Now, there is a Game Boy Light that was released exclusively in Japan, which is essentially a Game Boy Pocket with a backlight on it. I don't have it, so I didn't include it in this little test. By no means was this supposed to be like a scientific test or anything. It was just my personal preference and kind of just comparing and contrasting which ones I liked and which ones I didn't like. But overall, I gave my thoughts on the consoles. I would probably choose the Super Game Boy 2 out of all three of those. And then in terms of the Game Boys, if I had to choose between all of them, I'd probably go with the Game Boy Color. I just prefer the Game Boy Color with the Game Boy camera just for overall aesthetics and overall just how it feels in your hand. I think the form factor just works really well for taking photos. The top-mounted cartridge slot like this is really how the Game Boy camera was probably designed, and I think it works really well with the Game Boy Color. But if you're on the fence about any of these, I think you really can't go wrong with any Game Boy model aside from the SP. I would avoid using the SP with the Game Boy camera, just with that bottom-mounted cartridge slot. It doesn't work out well at all. Now, the original DS and the DS Lite also do have Game Boy slots, which I didn't try because those technically aren't Game Boy models. But if you do want me to try those down the road in a different video, please be sure to let me know in the comments. I do love hearing from you guys. Thank you all so much for checking out Retro Game Attic. I really do appreciate you all. Have an awesome day, and I will see you on the next one.